So let me just say that tonight's session, like most of what I've done in this, needs to be a bit historically framed, just so you understand where this is all coming from. So I made available as suggested reading a rather complex document called Widening the Circle of Concern. It's almost 4 years old now. And it came out of a particular crisis in our denomination that goes back 6 years. And let me just recapitulate that a bit. So, our current president, my successor, Susan Frederick Gray, was elected 6 years ago. But her immediate elected predecessor, Peter Morales, actually resigned the presidency of the UUA about this time of year, like 3 months before his term was over, in a major crisis of conscience and almost questions. Well, in the time since I was president, one of the things that has happened is that the Unitarian Universalist Association has actually become, in some interesting ways, a bit more centralized, but also regionalized. We used to have 19 districts. They were not particularly efficient. One of the decisions I had to make back in the 1990s was whether we would abolish the districts. I decided that I had higher priorities, putting more emphasis on young adult work, more emphasis on anti-racism work. I wasn't going to tackle the districts. There were too many entrenched interests there. But my successors, bless their hearts, both of whom worked in congregational services, Bill Singford and Peter Morales, both men of color, one African American and then the next Hispanic, realized that these districts were not helping us, but were sucking up more energy than was entirely useful. But when you change a bureaucracy, you change the question of who's making the decisions, who's in charge, and how inclusive is that new structure. 6 years ago, the real crisis that precipitated the Widening the Circle of Concern report came about this way. Instead of having 19 districts, we had divided the country into half a dozen regions with UUA appointed staff and a lead person in each congregational services staff position. There was an opening for the lead position in the southeastern United States. Let me put it this way, the old Confederacy. The person selected was yet another white male. Well, at least another white person. Not all of the other lead congregational services people were either male or straight. But when that happened, it became apparent that there was a problem called preserving white supremacy. And it was called out by African American members of the UUA and women and people of different sexualities and identities. And there was a hullabaloo. It led to the person who had been in charge of all of congregational services resigning, followed by the resignation of the president of the association and the chief operating officer, and a period of transition that was quite tumultuous, where we had interim co-presidents, my successor, Bill Sinkford, the first African-American president of the UUA, plus one of the leading lay leaders in our anti-racism work, Leon Spencer, plus the Reverend Sophia Betancourt, who is now likely to become the new president of the UUA, the sole candidate who will be elected at our General Assembly in June. Well, this awkward transition, which my current successor has had to pick up on, and I think has done extraordinarily well with, led to the UUA board appointing a commission on institutional change. And the report of that institutional change is called, is the title of tonight's session. That is, they talked about how important it would be to do change at a level that would tackle the unspoken assumptions of white supremacy all throughout our culture and our movement. And let's not kid ourselves. We are not exempt from what is out there in the culture. In fact, the more liberal a religious movement is, the more likely it is to absorb whatever is out there in the culture. We're open, right? And that means that we are subject to things like, I think our dominant problem actually is individualistic consumerism. But built into that is an assumption that white people run the markets, the job placements, the institutions. And it takes a certain amount of self-consciousness to push back on that and to open up the institutions. So how do you do that? So the report, Widening the Circle of Concern, really says, look, this is not about you being a racist in your heart or soul. Forget that. It's the fact that you are swimming in a sea of assumptions that you may be completely unconscious of, but really affect the institutions that you belong to. And those institutions tend to perpetuate an assumption of white privilege, white supremacy, patriarchy, homophobia, and other discriminations, whether you realize it or not. So how do we build up a structure within our institutions in which we can be held accountable to people who are on the margins for the problems that we cause them? By the way, as a person of white, male, cis, heterosexual, married privilege, I would be the first person to say, This ain't easy. But it also is not about me or you. It's about how we change our institutions. So, widening the circle of concern. Let me just tell you a bit of my experience with it. So, when it came out, I was the president of the Unitarian Universalist History and Heritage Society. You would think that would be one of the conservative organizations that would want to keep things the same, right? Nope. Actually, we were about to go into coalition with a wider organization called Collegium of Unitarian Universalist scholars who think about us. It's kind of both from an inside and an outside point of view. What holds us back? What do we need to be thinking about ethically, theologically? And the new organization, the Unitarian Universalist Studies Network, of which I am now the retiring treasurer. I needed to preserve some continuity about money and how it's used and what if fiduciary responsibilities we have. That studies network, we collectively read, every single one of us, this full report on adapting to a new understanding in which we widen the circle of concern about inherited assumptions of white supremacy and other privilege. And how do we build into our institutions structures of accountability that will help us move through a difficult transition in which we are each accountable to one another and to the whole of our community for the problems that we have inherited. Not that we have committed them, but that we have inherited. That include the fact that if you go back to our deep roots in New England and beyond, some of our congregations there have acknowledged that, oh, the land our first parish in North Andover is on, that was stolen from Native Americans. Our early ministers, buried in our graveyard next door, in the 18th century, they all owned slaves. King's Chapel in Boston, a congregation with which I have an ongoing connection, our oldest congregation, founded in 1686, has been dealing with the fact that between that year and a century later, when the American Revolution came along and the new Constitution in Massachusetts ended slavery in that particular state, the wealthy people in the congregation earned most of their money from their plantations in Barbados, from the 212 now identified named enslaved persons that they brought to America who went through that congregation. I don't think any of us can claim that we are not in a culture that assumes white supremacy. I just finished reading a book that is about a more recent period, but only a century ago. Do you know that in 1923, the Ku Klux Klan nearly took over the governance of both the state of Indiana and the state of Oregon? It had one purpose in the face of the end of slavery and what they perceived as too much immigration, preserve white supremacy. We don't have anybody saying that way out loud anymore. But boy, is it still built into the culture. So the challenge built into this whole process that I've been laying before you that revolves around the eighth principle, the revision of the purposes of the UUA, called Article 2, neither of which, by the way, is incompatible. All has to do with this question: are we prepared to really recognize that we swim in a sea of white supremacy, and what are we going to do about it? So I will be the first one to say, I think this is a huge challenge and filled with all kinds of dilemmas and challenges at the personal, interpersonal, and congregational level. As I understand it from you, Jody, at the annual meeting in June, there will be a vote. Does UUP endorse the basic principles of the eighth principle, which is an admission of swimming in a sea of white supremacy and some institutional commitment to try to push against that? I will tell you that if we take that up and take it seriously, I see Carol West here, who comes to us from South Africa. This will not be easy work. It will have to do with a good deal of internal denial and difficulty and interpersonal conflict, especially potentially with our own rather limited number of people of color. But if we want to be truly open and hold to our principles, I think we've got to do this. So widening the circle of concern is a denominational report. We don't have to do everything that's in it. It has got something like 187 literal recommendations, most of them aimed at the UUA, but it also suggests that other organizations within the family need to do some things to set up structures of accountability in which we question ourselves about whether we are practicing assumptions of white supremacy, even unconsciously. This is tough, but this is what it's about. And I think that's probably all I should sermonically say this evening before just asking everybody who is participating this evening to just jump in and ask whatever procedural or linguistic or other emotional questions arise from you about what it would mean to take this circle of concern, this assumption that we are still fighting a culture of white supremacy, into the life of UUP. That's where the rubber is going to hit the road. I'll stop there.